Alrighty, in this video we're going to put together the actual logic that will hit the API and do all the magical downloading of client and launching game logic. First thing we're going to do is we're going to remove these three lines. These three lines, again, were just for testing our view model. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this method asynchronous so that we can use the await keyword during its execution in order to not cause the user interface to stop while we're performing asynchronous operations, such as downloading the latest client, unzipping it, and all that fun stuff. Now, before we go ahead and actually write the implementation of login, I do want to add one more class to our project. And that class is going to represent the data that we're going to store in a JSON file that'll accompany the executable of our launcher. That JSON data file will be used to indicate to the launcher which version of the client is currently downloaded, and any other bits of data that we might have in it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come up here to buzzmmo.launcher. I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it launcher data. Inside launcher data, I'm going to say public int latest client version and get set. Or sorry, not latest client version, derp, current client version, because we won't know the latest client version until we query the API. Okay, so now that we have that class, let's jump back into our code behind. Again, it's a very simple class, but it's going to be used to indicate which version we've downloaded and all that fun stuff. Now, the first thing I want to do is kind of an early out. Basically, I want to validate the credentials that we had typed in against the API, and then if they are incorrect, I just want to basically exit out of the whole request and tell them to type in a proper username and password. So to do that, we need to first create an HTTP client. Now I'm going to create the HTTP client, and I'm also going to set up the progress bar as well, because that's something that is going to be on all of the requests that we make with this particular client. So what I'm going to do is just like what we did before in our startup XAML's code behind. I'm going to instantiate a new progress handler. I'm going to say new progress message handler, which of course will bring in system.net HTTP handlers up at the top. And then, as its only parameter, I'm going to satisfy that with a default instantiation of the HTTP client handler, which of course brings in system.net HTTP up at the top. Now that I've instantiated my progress handler, I do need to listen to the event that it invokes during any sort of operation. And so that's going to be progress handler.http receive progress, and then I'm going to say plus equals http receive progress. And this is going to be a method that I'm about to write. And this method is going to be pretty much the exact same method that we had written before inside of our startup XAML. So I'm going to say private void http receive progress object sender, and then I'm going to say http progress event args e. I'm going to say dispatcher dot invoke, and then I'm going to say view model dot percent, which is a terrible name, equals progress percentage. And the conversion is implicit since it's from an int to a double. Okay, so now that we have that set up, so anytime we use this progress handler, we will have our progress bar, update. I'm then going to say var http client equals new http client, and I'm going to pass in our progress handler as this message handler. Okay, so like I said, the first thing that we need to do is we need to hit the API that'll validate the credentials of the user. So if we look at our web project, underneath our controllers, API v1, we have this authentication controller. If we open it up, we see that it's the route prefix is API v1 authentication, and then we have this validate action, which will take in an auth validate request, and it'll return an auth validate response that'll indicate whether or not these credentials are correct. Or it'll also indicate that whether or not the game is currently enabled for that particular user. So let's come back into our code behind and let's hit that API. I'm going to move this off to the side so I can remind myself what that API endpoint is when we actually go to write it. Okay, so come back here. Let's go ahead and make that request. I'm going to say var auth response equals, I'm pretty much going to follow this pattern for most of what we're going to do. I should probably have turned this, what I'm about to do, into an extension method of sorts. Well, you know what? I think I will. I think I'm not going to turn it to an extension method, but I think I'm going to turn the concept of hitting this HTTP client into a private method on this form, because we're going to need to make a couple of them in order to write this method. And so, again, because we're going to do this multiple times, I want to kind of abstract it into a method first. So before I complete line 25, I'm going to jump down and write a new method. It's going to say private t-response. Let's say, well, we also have to do a get string, and we also have to do a post. So let's say t-response, well, there's a variety of ways we can do this. I'll just do a post first. So post, HTTP post, string API endpoint, object parameters. That should be all we need. Of course, this is a generic method, so I must add the generic parameter t-response. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var response, or sorry, I'm just say, well, we need to also accept our HTTP client, of course. So I'll say client. Now I'm going to say return JSON convert, which will necessitate we bring in newtonsoft.json namespace up at the top of our file, dot deserialize object, and then I'm going to pass in as a generic parameter t-response. For the API end, or sorry, for the innards of this, I'm going to go ahead and write client.get, or sorry, post async. Now post async is going to require that we provide a bunch of data. So we need to provide our request URI, our value, and our formatter. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the formatter can take in a default. But there's actually going to be a much better way to use this particular class in order to make a JSON post request. And that is, if I come up here, there's an extension method called post as JSON async, which seems to be exactly what we want to do. So I'm going to say post as JSON async, and then I'm going to pass in the request URI and the value that we want to post. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say string.format http://placeholder/placeholder. The first placeholder will be set to configuration manager, which is underneath system.configuration, app settings, and then we're going to pass in the indexer, and we're going to pass in the app setting that's responsible for our web API domain, which not surprisingly is web API domain. The second placeholder I'm going to fill with API endpoint. The next parameter, the t value, I'm going to provide parameters. Now you notice it's going to error out, and the reason it's going to error out is for two reasons. First of all, we're not awaiting, and second of all, post as JSON async does not return a string. So what I'm going to do, so first of all, again, this is an async method, I believe. Yes, it is an async method that we can await on. And then I need to extract this string from it. So I'm actually going to take this whole line, I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to say var response equals this, but I'm going to await on it. So I'm going to say var response equals await client post as JSON async, and then I'm just going to post all that data. And then, of course, because I'm using await, I must make this method async. So I'll say async. And then, of course, I must make it a task of t-response, which is going to require that we bring in system threading tasks. Again, when you return a value, you have to wrap it in a sync method. You have to wrap it in a task of type. Okay, so then when we return our JSON deserialization, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's see. I wonder if response.toString actually returns a string, or I'm going to have to extract the stream itself with a stream reader. Really hope I don't, but that's where decompilation comes into play here. Now, I don't actually think that it would be a good idea to return the content as a string. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so it does that. So let's see, how would we extract? We can extract it with HTTP content. Oh, read as string async. There we go. And since it's an async method, we have to wait on that as well. Okay, so that's our... It's a good thing I'm doing this here in a method, because we have to do this again another time later, so we don't have to repeat all of that code. But anyway, so the point here is that we post this JSON async to that specified API endpoint with the specified parameters. There's one other thing that I'm concerned about, however, and that has to do with types. If we look at the signature of post as JSON async, you'll notice that the value is actually going to be a generic type. Now it's filling in the generic type parameter right now with object because it's inferring that from what we're passing in, but this is a generic method. Now right now we're passing in an object parameters, which means at compile time we'll lose the type that was passed into HTTP post, which might confuse the HTTP client. I'm not sure if it will, but it might. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another generic parameter to HTTP post. I'm going to say tResponse, comma, tRequest. And then I'm going to have tRequest be the parameters. The reason I'm doing that is that'll propagate the actual type that we pass in at the call site all the way down into the HTTP client in the case that the HTTP client actually requires compile time types in order to do something like reflection or whatever. Uses like the type of operator instead of using the runtime type, which would be .getType. Anyway, so that's our HTTP post. That should pretty much wrap up that method. So now we can say auth response equals await on HTTP post, and we have to pass in our response type and our request type. Now our response type, if you recall from our web project, is going to be an auth validate request, or sorry, our response type is an auth validate response. So I'm going to say auth validate response, which comes in from our Buzz MMO base project. And then our request type is auth, auth validate request. For our parameters, we're going to pass in our HTTP client. The API endpoint will be API v1 authentication validate. And our final thing, our auth validate parameters will be our username and password. I'm going to break this out into multiple lines so it's easier to read. For our username, it's going to be viewModel.username, and for our password, it's going to be password.password. Now the final thing I want to do, well, a couple more things I want to do, is before we actually make that HTTP post, I want to say viewModel.status equals logging in, ... And then after this, I just want to say viewModel.status equals auth response dot credentials are valid dot toString. The reason I'm doing that is for testing purposes, because I want to go ahead and test that we're hitting the API correctly. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and hit F5 and see what happens. Querying for latest launcher, which it should not return a version that's bigger than what it was built with. Okay, username, bleh and bleh. Hit enter. Logging in false. Sweet. So now let's try admin. Logging in, still false. Now the reason that might be false for a couple of reasons, but one of them I think I did mmo.3dbuzz.sta for the site. I believe that's the site it's hitting. We'll figure that shortly, but if we go to mmo3dbuzz.sta and we type in admin, which is the most secure password combination in the world, I would say it's even more secure than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Go to admin, and then see it says game enabled for roles admin and registered. I'm going to go ahead and enable it for both of them. Then we hit login. It says logging in. It still says false. Okay, so let's go ahead and debug this. I'm going to go ahead and bring this out here. I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint right there. I'm going to hit the button. And what we get is indeed false. So now let's go ahead and debug the website itself. So the way I'm going to debug the website itself to see exactly what's going on, to see exactly what the API is getting hit with, is first of all, this is important. I'm going to launch the launcher with Control F5 so that the launcher is not launched in debug mode. Then I'm going to right-click the website and say debug, start new instance. Oh, wait a sec, that's not going to matter because I believe we're not hitting my dev site. I believe we're hitting the sta site, which I can validate by going into app.config. And, oh no, that's, we are hitting the dev site. Derp to derp. Let's wait for Visual Studio to catch up. It's freezing because it likes to do that. Because it's Visual Studio. It wouldn't be Visual Studio if it didn't freeze all the time. Okay, I'm seriously just about to pause the video so you guys don't have to endure my voice while you wait for... Yeah, we're pausing. Be right back. Alrighty, and we're back. Sorry about that. Alright, let's go ahead and jump over to MMO2.3dbuzz.com or 3dbuzz.dev, which is my dev site. Now again, I'm pretty sure what happened is that I have disabled the game for all roles, including admins. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here over to the admin of the site and enable it for admins. Hit save. Come back here. Okay, let's type in some bogus stuff. Hit enter, we get false. Now let's type in admin and test, hit enter. And true, we have validated correctly. See, isn't that cool? I can come over here on the site, uncheck admin, hit save, hit login, we get false. Come back here, check admin, hit save, come back here, and we get true. That's really cool. At least I think it's cool. I don't know if anybody else does. Alrighty. So now that we have that done, we can now know if the user's credentials were correct or not. So I'm going to remove this line of code right here, this viewModel.status. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if if not authResponse.credentials are valid, viewModel.status equals invalid user name or password. Return. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do the rest of it. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to establish what the currently downloaded version of the client is. So I'm going to say var launcher data equals new launcher data. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if file, which will require we import system.io, exists launcher.data, then I'm going to say try launcher data equals JSON convert dot deserialize object launcher data, passing in as the parameter file dot read all text launcher dot data. Then I'm going to say catch, and I'm going to leave the catch block empty, and that's it. So what we're doing here is we're instantiating new launcher data in the case that the launcher data does not exist or the data is in an invalid format, which results in an exception being thrown on this line. If an exception is thrown on this line or the file doesn't exist, we instantiate a default launcher data, which will have a version number of 0, which will necessitate that we download a client. So now that we've done that, we are fairly certain that we have the current version of the client that's currently downloaded. So now what I can do is actually request the latest version of the client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say underscore viewModel.status equals something. How about querying for latest client? Then I'm going to go ahead and say var latest client equals JSON convert deserialize object latest client result, passing it await on HTTP client dot get string async. I'm going to hop over to a new line. I'll say string dot format HTTP colon slash slash placeholder slash API v1 clients latest with the placeholder of configuration manager app settings web API domain. And that's it. Then I'm going to say if latest client, if launcher data dot current client version is greater or equal to latest client dot version, then launch client return. Actually, I'm going to say await launch client and return, because launch client is going to be in the synchronous method. Okay, so now that we've done that, the launch client method, again, has not been written yet. We're going to write it shortly. So now we know that the website has a later version of the client than what we already have. So we need to actually go ahead and download it. So to do that, also launch client, I'm going to pass in the web, the HTTP client into that. I'm just putting that argument in there just to remind me in the future that we'll need a reference to that HTTP client. Okay, so now let's go ahead and download the client. That's actually really easy to do. I'm going to say underscore view model status equals downloading latest client. Then I'm saying using var stream equals await on HTTP client get stream async, and then I'm going to pass in latest client dot download URL. Then I'm going to say using var file stream equals file dot open, and we'll do client dot temp, or how about client dot tmp, and then I'm going to pass in file mode dot, I believe truncate is the one I would want, specifying that it should open existing file. No. How about open or create? Create new. No. Progress in the file does not otherwise use. Yeah, create is what I want. I always forget those. I don't know why. I've used them a million times over the last however many years I've been writing .NET, but I always forget the file modes. Anyway, so let's open up that, and then let's say await on stream dot copy to async file stream. And that's it. By the time we get to the end here, we will have copied the client download to client.tmp. Okay, so now let's go ahead and extract it. But first I want to go ahead and delete the folder that we're going to be stuffing it in, so that when we extract it, we'll be overwriting all that other junk. So I'm going to say if directory.exists client, then directory delete client, and then true for recursive. Then I'm going to say directory.create directory client. Then I'm going to go ahead and unzip it. So I'm going to say viewModel.status equals extracting client. And then I'm going to say using var zip equals zip file, which comes from ionic.zip, which I got a using statement for just now, .read, and then I'm going to pass in client.tmp. Then I'm going to say for each var entry in. Actually, I wonder if there's a method here that'll extract all. Extracts all the files in the zip archive to specified. Well, actually, no, because what I want to do is I want to set the progress bar while we're extracting. So I'm going to say for each var entry in zip.entries. Then I'm going to say, or wait, how do I want to do this? I really want this to be asynchronous, actually, and I want it to call back into the progress bar to update the progress value while we're extracting. So what we're going to do here is a little trick. I'm going to say await on task.run, and I'm going to pass in a multi-line lambda, and I'm going to take this using var zip stuff, and I'm going to dump it up here inside of that lambda. And then I'm going to say for each var entry in zip.entries, entry dot extract, and then I'm going to pass in the base directory. So the base directory is, of course, going to be client. Then I'm going to say dispatcher invoke viewModel dot percent equals, I'm going to say zip, or I need a counter, don't I? So before I do this for each loop, sorry for all the jumping around. I just need to remind myself how this ionic zip thing works. Say total entries equals zip entries count, and I'm going to say var current entry equals 0. Then I'm going to say viewModel percent equals, well, I don't need to cast to an int, but let's say double current entry divided by total entries multiplied by 100. That'll give me the percentage. Then after I'm done, I'll say current entry plus plus. Or I could do the current entry plus plus after the extract. I think that makes a little bit more sense because, for example, when we're on the first item, after we extract that first item, we'll be at current entry of 1, and then we'll send that off. Of course, this current entry is going to be hoisted, which isn't a problem, actually, in this particular case, and I'm okay with it being hoisted. Alternatively, you can also have it only report or only do the dispatcher every so many times. You know what I mean? Like maybe after every 50 items, it'll update the percentage. Could do that too. It'd be more efficient. But I think in this case, we'll have so few files. And when I say so few files, I mean under 1,000. This will not be an issue. The dispatcher can easily handle this load. Okay, so now we have extracting the client done. So really, the last thing we have to do is say await launch client, passing in our HTTP client. Or no, after we finish this task run, we have to go and actually save our launcher data. We have to update launcher.data with the latest version that we just downloaded. So I'm going to say launcher data dot current client version equals latest client dot version, and then I'm going to say file write all text JSON convert serialize object. Actually, it wants the file name first, doesn't it? Derp to derp. Serialize object launcher data. And that pretty much completes this monolithic method. Now you might be saying, Nelson, this method looks really, really ugly. And I would agree with you. It's a very big, ugly method that does quite a few different things. But really, in all honesty, it's pretty straightforward, high-level stuff. Now we could break it up into steps. We could do things like extracting the client as another method. That might be a little bit cleaner, but it would also break up the code a little bit and it would be more difficult for you guys to see how it's going. As a challenge to people, you could try cleaning this up, preferably by extracting this into a separate class, into kind of like a service layer that allows you to perform all these operations in a more object-oriented manner. But for now, since it's still it's a very procedural process that we're going through with establishing the latest version of the client. So I'm not too keen on abstracting much of any of this, basically because, again, it's a kind of a one-off, very procedural, very high-level process that is not going to be repeated anywhere. So I'm not too keen on trying to object-orientify this. Just keep it as procedural as possible to keep some clarity. But the method is very large, and it's very ugly, and it has a lot of problems with it. Mainly how ugly and large it is. But we're just going to keep it like this. This is fine for what we're doing. the final thing that we need to do is actually launch the client. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Down here, I'm going to go ahead. Well, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say private async void launch client HTTP client. Oh, what are you? The type void is not awaitable. Okay, fine. Private async task launch client, if you want to be that way. And then I'm going to say view model.status equals launching client. Now what I'm doing here is I'm not going to fill this in with anything quite yet. I just want to test it to make sure that everything else is working. So I'm going to hit F5. And then username admin, password test, logging in, downloading, extracting, launching. And it worked. However, you will notice that our items never stopped, or our login buttons and our password and our username never got grayed out. So let's go ahead and fix that. Basically, what to do that is I have to go to the top of the file, and I'm going to say basically at the top of login, I'm going to say view model.can login equals false, and then on this return right here, right before it, I'm going to reset can login to true. Now let's hit F5. All right, and you'll notice it didn't download the client that time, which is good because that's exactly the behavior that we want. Let's go ahead and see what happened. I'm going to on the file system, I'm going to open up the launcher. I'm going to open up bin, debug, and now we see a couple interesting things. First of all, I forgot to delete the client temp. I'll do that here momentarily. Second, we see the client actually downloaded and extracted, which is really cool. And finally, we should see a launcher.data file. And if we open that up, we see that current client version is indeed set to 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and clean up that client temp. I'm also going to go ahead and delete launcher.data and client. Delete those. I'm going to come back here and let's see here. What am I doing? I'm going down here after we extract. I want to say file.delete client.tmp. In fact, I want to do this inside of the task itself so that it doesn't, if it takes a while to delete the client, doesn't hang the user interface. Now let's hit F5. Waiting for latest launcher. Let's go ahead and log in. Admin temp. Logging in. Invalid username or password. No. Oh, it's temp, or it's test, sorry. All right, it all works. Now there's one thing I don't like about that, and that is it doesn't reset the progress bar down to 0 before every one of the steps. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that too. So every time we set viewModel.status, I want to set the progress bar value down to 0. In fact, the easiest way to do that, well, yeah, I'll just go ahead and do that. Nah, yeah, no. I'll just do it manually. Well, no, I won't. I'm going to go inside the view model. Every time you change the status to something, I'm going to say % equals 0. So every time the status is changed, % is set back to 0, so the progress bar will look a little bit more natural. I'm going to jump back into wherever you ran off to. I must have closed the window. I didn't close the window, it just wasn't showing up in my thingy. Weird. Okay, I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to delete client and launcher.data. Come back here, hit F5. Now let's see if our progress bar behaves a little bit better. You guys might not have noticed the progress bar acting up because it went by so quickly. Yep. Alrighty. That seems like it worked perfectly. So the last thing that we have to do, the final thing we have to do, final last thing, is actually make this launcher launch the client. I mean, it did take a while, but hey, we're here. We're about to launch the process finally, but we still have to do one more thing. We have to hit the API to generate the authentication token that we're going to pass into Unity so that it can validate with Photon without the user having to log in again. So to do that, I'm going to say var auth response equals HTTP post. I'm going to pass in auth generate token response, comma, auth generate token request. I'm going to pass in client. The API endpoint is going to be authentication slash login. And then I'm going to pass in, well, let's go ahead and break this up again. I'm going to pass in viewModel.username, and then I'm going to pass in password.password. And of course, I do want to await on this. So I'm going to say auth response equals await HTTP post. Then what I'm going to do is, well, auth response. Well, then I can go and say if not auth response.credentials are valid, then viewModel status equals invalid username or password. This should never happen, but it might. And then I'm going to say viewModel can login equals true, and then simply return. Otherwise, we now finally have the token, so we can write the magic line of code that will cause the client to finally be launched. And that magic line of code is process, which is imported from system.diagnostics.start, and pass in path.combine, and I'm going to say client, comma, buzz MMO.exe. Then I'm going to pass in string.format dash token equals placeholder, passing in auth response dot token. Then the final last thing, hopefully the final code that we have to write to get our entire auto updater working properly. This is it, guys. I hope. It might not be. I probably have a bug somewhere. But still, is close, which will close down the window of our launcher because our game had just launched. Let's see what happens. I'm going to hit F5. Username, admin, password test, hit enter, logging in, launching client, and we get an error. Unlaunch client for some reason. Blah, blah, blah. JSON text reader. Parsing value, blah on blah. Weird. Let's see here. That's happening. Okay, I'm gonna copy this entire stack trace. I'm gonna show you guys a cool trick. I'm gonna go ahead and inside of Visual Studio, I'm gonna stop debugging. Then I'm gonna hit Control-ET, which will bring up this resharper window, which allows me to very easily find where exactly that happened. Okay, so that happened right there. Coming up here, it happened right there. So unfortunately, really didn't like something that was returned. I don't know exactly why. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close this out. I'm going to take this code right here, and I'm going to alias out into a variable. And I'm going to call this response string. And then I'm going to set a breakpoint right here. And then I'm going to hit F5. And this will allow me to inspect what was returned by the API. It's very possible that I got a URL wrong. Credentials are valid true. Okay. It looks like I did get a URL wrong. The resource cannot be found. All right, well, that's not too bad. That means I just have a little spelling error somewhere, which is entirely unheard of when you're talking about me. Not quite. Oh, I forgot the prefix. API v1. There we go, hit F5. I think Visual Studio heard that I was saying that I was writing the last line of the launcher, and then threw that mistake into my code, so that I had to go back and change some code. That's what I'm sticking to right now. And we have Unity. Alrighty. So, let's go ahead and test this. So how we're going to test this? Well, we're going to push this to my repository. Then we're going to use Team City to build a new launcher. And we're going to see if this guy that I have right here works. Remember this guy? I don't know if I did this on video, but this is the launcher, an actual launcher that hasn't been updated yet. So I just made a ton of changes to my launcher, just completely changed the way it works. And I'm going to launch my launcher that I have on my computer that's built in release mode that will query the main site after I perform the Team City tasks. So once I perform this Team City tasks, the next time I click on this launcher, it should update. Because if you recall, if I click on this launcher now, it queries for the latest launcher, which will take a sec because it needs to spool up. And says data binding is awesome. Because I did a push and a Team City thingy later, or earlier anyway. I do want to make one change. This is cosmetic entirely. I'm going to jump into startup.xaml. And I really don't like that padding on that bottom underneath that progress bar, so I'm going to get rid of it. To get rid of it, I just really need to get rid of the last row. So I'm just going to remove the last row, and then maybe increase the size of the row above it to maybe 50, 20, 30, 25. There we go. That's fine. All right, you guys ready? You ready, Steve, to see
You show
all the work that we've been doing in the last month and a half?
Show me the magic.
I will, after Visual Studio stops.
Wait for crashing. The magic.
So what I'm going to do is, once Visual Studio gets its act together, I'm going to do a push. Then I'm going to launch this nice little application I have sitting right here that I don't have an icon for yet. We'll get that figured out soon. And it'll auto-update itself after we push the Team City. And then I'll show you guys an example of changing Unity, or at least the client in Unity, and having it perform the actual auto-updating. Okay, this is just getting ridiculous, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to opt for the nuclear option. Nuclear option is always the best option. Well, I mean, not if you're into like preserving the human race. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I fired up the task manager, and I guess Visual Studio like figured what I was about to do and got its act together and stopped lagging. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring over source tree. I'm going to go ahead and stage all these files. I'm going to say commit. I'm going to make sure I select push commits immediately to origin, and I'm going to say launcher v1 commit. All right, now that I've done that, I'm going to load up Team City. So if you recall, this is our CI tool right here that I have running on my virtual machine. And I'm going to deploy the launcher. So hit that button, wait a couple minutes, and we'll be good. So this is it, guys. This is the whole point of what we've been doing this entire time, is just to be able to push a change to a repository, click a button, and get that change basically pushed out to every one of our clients. So it's very important stuff if you're serious about having a very tight feedback loop with especially your customers. Because you guys, once we get this game going, are going to be relying on this launcher pretty much every week if we start doing tests that frequently. Okay, the launcher is deployed. Let's go ahead and see if the launcher updates itself. Downloading launcher, and look, it updated itself that quickly. Well, because I'm on a local network, so I'm kind of cheating. All right, username admin, password is admin. Logging in, downloading list client, extracting client, launching client, play, and we have Unity. All right, so that's pretty cool, but let's one-up that. I'm going to go ahead and launch Unity, and I'm going to open up the client project inside of Unity. Then we have our loader scene. I'm going to go inside of the loader scene. I'm also going to make sure that the loader scene is added to our build, which it is. I'm going to come into the camera, and I'm just going to do something simple. I'm just going to change the color of the camera to, how about this obnoxious red color? Or how about a less obnoxious color, because I don't want to burn my eyeballs out. There we go. I mean, that's not an obnoxious color, but it sure is ugly. All right, Steve, this is it.
I wait with bated
I made
breath.
a change to Unity. Let's see.
Do it.
Alrighty. So I made the change there. I saved it out. Now I'm going to perform 2 steps, and these 2 steps are going to make this change available to every one of the customers that we have on this particular system, which right now is just me. I'm going to do 2 steps. First of all, I'm going to load up source tree. I'm going to stage my files. I'm going to commit them. I'm going to say push commits immediately to origin. And then I'm going to type in something. It's just literally type in something because I can't think anymore. I'm going to push and commit. I'm going to close that out, open up Team City, and I'm going to say deploy client. Now this is going to take a minute because it does take a minute for Unity to get its own act together and actually do stuff. But basically what's going on, actually you guys know exactly what's happening right now because you've been here throughout this entire setup of creating this auto updater. But just to recap, what's happening right now is it's running through our MS build project file, which will increment our version numbers, encode the timestamp into the executable itself, inform Unity to perform a standalone build, zip that build up, publish it to an API endpoint, and then when we launch our launcher, it'll grab that latest client. At least that's what I hope it does. And now, of course, since I said that, it's not going to. Okay, we have deployed our client. Let's launch the launcher. Type in the username and password. Hit login. Oh, come on. Extracting client. Launching client. Hit play. And we have brown. So what I just simulated was making one change inside of Unity, pushing it to a repository, hitting one button, and then every single person who has the game clicks on the launcher and receives that change.
You are a god among men.
Furthermore, I've already logged in.
Oh no.
I mean, not really.
You are.
Let's check one more thing though. I'm going to open up my VM, and I'm going to make sure that my authentication tokens are being generated. My client authentication tokens, if you recall. Because remember, these are going to be used to authenticate with Photon. And as you see, our token is being generated. And we can see the timestamp is correct, because it's an UTC, so it's 8 hours in advance. Which means that when again, the client was passed in that token so that it can authenticate with Photon. But yeah, can't be simpler. I mean, obviously we had a lot of complicated infrastructure to create this whole system, but now that it's created, it can't be simpler for updating either the launcher or the client. Now, there's a lot of other fun stuff that we can do with the launcher. For example, saving the user's password is one of them. Another thing could be cleaning up this method, particularly getting rid of all the magic strings I have in here and just how long it is and annoying it is to deal with. You could also do something like the launcher could have a not autoplay, but have a button that determines whether or not the game will automatically launch after it's been downloaded and extracted. You could have a news feed on your launcher if you want. It's just really limitless as to what you can do now with basically the launcher and the website. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do using those APIs. But this is really just the bare minimum that I'm comfortable with proceeding with the project. Because again, having to require people to go to a site, re-download everything, it gets annoying. Especially for me, when I need to test things, it gets annoying. Because there's often times when I want to test something on a different computer, and the feedback cycle is just really slow unless you have something like this. But this is a very straightforward way to keep all of your client systems up to date. Very valuable system from a variety of standpoints, and a whole lot of interesting content. So I think that pretty much, unless I think of something before we get to recording the next stuff, I think this pretty much is the end of the auto updater. I mean, I reserve the right to decide, hey, let's, do something else with this if I think of something that I completely forgot about. But for now, I think this is just does what we need to.
Of course you reserve the right. You're a god among men, as we just stated.
Yeah. Alrighty, guys. We will see you in the next video.